Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Luke. And just a reminder again that today is the third Sunday of the month, so it'll be an extended homily question-answer discussion today. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them, he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone." The devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, "I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours." Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." The devil led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourselves down from here, because it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully. They will lift you up in their hands so that you do not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." When the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until an opportune time. The gospel inspired by God. So they were born about a half a millennium apart. One of them was born a prince, and the other guy pretty much born a pauper. And they came from two extraordinary civilizations, two civilizations that have really bequeathed our world so many good things. And they both set out to become enlightened. And the end of the process for one of these guys, it culminated in a 49-day meditation under the Bodhi tree, and he became enlightened. And for the other guy, it culminated in a 40-day fast in the wilderness and led to his enlightenment. And at the end of that preparation period, both of them were very seriously tempted. And then they began their public ministries. At age 30, both of them were age 30 when they began their public ministries. And immediately they were both accosted by the priestly caste, asking them who gave them a license to preach. Could they show their documentation? Where were their credentials to allow them to preach? And one of them, his public ministry lasted only 3 years. And the other guy, his public ministry lasted about 50 years. And one of them died a very, very horrendous death at early 30s. And the other guy died of food poisoning at the age of 80. And of course, I'm talking about two great characters, Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, and Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ. And I want to talk about that today. I want to take this one piece, one of the things they had in common, this extraordinary temptation that they were both subjected to at the moment of enlightenment before they began their public ministries. And I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. I'm going to talk about Jesus' first temptation, Jesus' second temptation, Jesus' third temptation, and then the purpose of temptation. So we look at Jesus' first temptation. And I want to tell you firstly that in the gospel, there are 3 gospel accounts of the temptation of Jesus. You get it in Mark's gospel, in Matthew's gospel, and in Luke's gospel. But in some senses, these kind of classical rendition of the temptation is literally the distillation of all of the temptations that Jesus Christ encountered throughout his lifetime. So it's interesting that Matthew and Luke put it very differently. Matthew says Jesus went into the desert and he fasted for 40 days and then he was tempted. Luke says he went into the wilderness and he was tempted for 40 days and he fasted during that period of time. So in actual fact, obviously, like any other human being, temptation is not something that gets squeezed between the bookends, of a 40-day period. It's something we encounter throughout our lifetimes. So at the end of today's reading, if you were listening very carefully, you heard Luke say, after the third temptation, the devil departed until an opportune time. Because he came back. He came back many, many times, obviously, but very significantly, in the last 24 hours of Jesus' life, two of the most difficult temptations of all. One in the Garden of Gethsemane, where it was so bad that he actually sweated blood, and the other day, next day on the cross, hanging on the cross, where he was in despair for a few moments, and he cried out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you abandoned me? And so the temptations go on through his entire lifetime. So this is kind of a distillation telling us what the kind of the core issues were in the life of Jesus. So what was the first one? Ostensibly, it was he's been fasting for 40 days. The devil has been watching this performance. And he says to him, you're very hungry, obviously. Take this stone and turn it into bread. Let me see a demonstration of your power, if you're an enlightened being. Now, that's the kind of the most obvious temptation. But there are two other levels at which you could unpack it. I don't think it was just that the devil was saying, take this one stone and turn it into one loaf of bread and eat it and prove to me that you're an enlightened being. It may have been that it was an invitation not just to feed himself with a loaf of bread, but to indulge in all kinds of sensuality. He was telling Jesus, okay, let's see how good you are. Live the good life. Go live the good life. If you're this enlightened being, go out, live the good life. Give into all kinds of sensuality, and then we'll find out what kind of a mensch you are. That's the second way of unpacking it. But the one that I like a lot is this following. I think what Satan was saying to Jesus at this stage was, don't just turn this stone into bread and feed yourself. Turn all the stones in all the deserts of the world into bread and feed everybody. If you're this compassionate being and you have this power, why don't you just turn all the stones of all the deserts, in the world into bread and feed everybody? Now, Moses had done a little version of that with the manna in the desert. So if you're second Moses, why can't you do it in all the deserts of the world? So why couldn't he? Why didn't Jesus take this opportunity? Why didn't he just make food available for everybody, every place? Because that's not what life on planet Earth is about. Life on planet Earth is not creating miracles where everybody has all their needs met. It is about creating a situation where we need each other and we need love and we need to share our resources with each other because we're here to learn how to love, not just how to feed ourselves. And if in fact all food were available for everybody all the time, here's what would happen. The great temptation of the Buddha and the equivalent of this Satan in Buddhism is Mara. And Mara tested the Buddha just after he became enlightened and said to him, look at the Himalayas, the highest mountains, the greatest king. The phrase he used was, the king of all the mountains. Why don't you turn the Himalayas, the king of all the mountains, into gold if you're really an enlightened one? And the Buddha's response is, even if I were to turn all the mountains of the world into gold, there wouldn't be enough for one person's greed. And so, no matter how much food Jesus would have created by turning all the stones in all the deserts of the world into food, it would have been hoarded and weaponized. Because that's precisely what happened at the agricultural revolution 5,000 years ago. When in 3000 BC, the digging stick, which was horticulture, where you just dug with a little stick again and again, and you eked out a living, we developed the ox-drawn plow so we could mass produce food. And at the same time, we developed glazed pottery jars so that there was no water spoilage. You could store food for years because the water couldn't seep through a glazed pot. And if you bunged it at the top, the rodents couldn't get into it. So we mass-produced food. And what was the result? Food became a weapon of war. So you could burn the enemy's granaries, or you could salt their terrain and nothing would grow again. Or if you were the emperor, you could hoard the food and dispense it only to the faithful, whoever the faithful were. In actual fact, this represented a huge change in human history, the agricultural revolution. It was the first time ever that it became possible to have empires. The first empires happened at this stage, because now you're not worrying about food production all around the year. It's at this stage that men became in charge of production and women were in charge of reproduction. Because with the ox-drawn plow, women could not take part in producing food in the same way that they could with the digging stick, because pushing an ox-drawn plow or guiding it led to frequent miscarriages. And so women now are sequestered. Their job is reproduction and the men's job is production. And this is the first time ever you get empires, war all year round, 24/7, 365 days of the year. And it's the first time that women are sequestered and you have the possibility of harems. So it radically changed the human equation. So the fact that there was enough food for everybody didn't matter a damn, because now food is hoarded and it is weaponized. I saw an example of that myself in my own time in Kenya. In 1984 and 1985, I lived right on the edge of the desert in an area called Baringo. And in 1984-85, there was a very, very, very severe famine. And people were dying. A lot of people were dying. So I made a contact in the World Bank in Nairobi, and they agreed to give me 3 lorry loads of food every month. They gave me soy milk, granola, and oil, canola oil, and wheat. So I got 3 lorry loads of food every month to dispense in the villages in my area. And I remember the first colony, the first 3 lorries that came in, and we drove it down into this village and opened down the tail of the lorries, and we got savaged. The entire population just descended upon us and ransacked the lorries. And of course, as you imagine, it was the big, strong guys who got the food, and the little people got no food. It was a total shock to me. Now, it was a big punch to my ego as well, because I felt, I am this great big, white savior come in with lorry loads of food, for the starving natives. I very, very quickly learned my lesson. So they ransacked the lorries. Within half an hour, there was nothing left. And the little people and the children got nothing, and the big, strong guys could do it, went off with it. And so that's what would happen if Jesus had simply turned all the stones in all the deserts in the world into bread. They would have been hoarded and weaponized. So Jesus is teaching, no, that is not the way to go. Food is about sharing with each other. Food is about learning to love. Food is about sitting down, commensality, sharing with each other, loving each other, creating family together, whether that's the family of a household, or the family of a community, or the family of a nation, or the family of the globe. So Christ, in resisting this temptation, wasn't just resisting a temptation to feed himself. He was resisting the bigger temptation of just having this miraculous display that would just be hoarded and weaponized by the powers that be. So he said, no, thank you. So he moves on to the second temptation. And the second temptation, Satan takes him to a very, very high mountain. In my meditation this morning, I had this image that he actually took him to the top of Mount Everest, and at the end of Everest was the Buddha looking up and saying, how are you going to handle this one? And he takes him to the top and he shows him all the kingdoms of the world. And he says, if you bow down and worship me, I'll give you power over all these kingdoms because they're mine to give to whomsoever I want. Now, on the face of it, this seems ridiculous. Why would Jesus bow down and worship Satan? But the temptation wasn't that. The temptation was the following. If you kind of sign up to be powerful, I guarantee you, I'll give you the ability to conquer the entire world. And then you can do as you wish. You can put people in authority in all parts of the world who'll be loving administrators. You can take charge of the economic process, take charge of the political process, take charge of the military process, and then you can usher in a reign of peace. I remember as a small child, in my innocence, thinking, really seriously thinking, growing up Catholic, that if only the world had the wisdom to appoint a Catholic bishop as president of every country in the world, there'd be instant peace on planet Earth. I really believed it. I couldn't believe that people were so dumb that they didn't just put a bishop in charge of every country in the world and there'd be instant peace. And then I started reading church history. Very happy there weren't bishops in charge of every country. You see what happened when they had the papal states, but I was totally convinced of it. So this is the temptation to Christ. Take charge over the political process, the military process, the economic process, and impose a regime of peace. And so imagine Christ saying, okay, that sounds like a good idea. I got 12 disciples. I'm going to divide the world up into 12 segments, and I put one of the apostles in charge of each of these regions, and there'll be instant peace everywhere on planet Earth. The first thing that would happen, even if these goose guys, were good leaders, there'd be a coup. There'd be a coup in every area within 2 or 3 years. Because the people who weren't yet converted in their hearts would want to grab the power. So that's not how. You don't create peace by imposing a system on anyone. You can't legislate people into love. You can't legislate people into evolution. You can't do that. So remember another incident from my time in Kenya. As I say, I lived on the edge of the desert, so water was always a huge issue for us. So I was involved fairly frequently in water projects. And I remember at one stage, 2 different projects that really went south on me. A lot of the projects worked out very, very well. But in one particular project, we had gotten assistance from the European community. We had run pipes for about 3 miles to a water source. And after 2 years of this project, we turned on the faucet in the village square on a Sunday morning, everybody expecting the water would flow copiously, and nothing happened. Not a trickle of water came out of it. And then we went back along the line. It was just PVC piping. And a warrior from another area whose group hadn't got a water project just literally walked the length of the pipe, just jabbing his spear every 3 or 4 feet into the PVC piping. And the water was just spewing out in all directions. Another project, a similar project, where at the end of 2 years, we had delivered water to the village, and we turned on the village, and the water flowed very copiously. And 2 days later, everybody is down with dysentery because the source was polluted. And what it represented for me was this, that the pipes represent structures like the political system or the economic model or governance of various kinds. And the water represents the people who flow through the systems. And if any one of them is bad, if the pipes are corrupted or the water is contaminated, you're going to poison the consumer. And that's what Christ is saying. So change only happens when good structures, are staffed by people who are committed to their own personal transformation. You can't just impose a structure on people who are not transformed and expect that it's going to work. And even if you have good people and the structures are leaky, you're still not going to deliver. And so the task somehow is the evolution of the individual person in our own transformation, and at the same time the dismantling of corrupt systems and the erection of better systems. But they have to go hand in hand, or otherwise one is going to corrupt the other. So that was Jesus' second temptation, it seems to me. Just impose a system, govern from the top down and impose a peace model on people. It wouldn't last, diddly squat. There'd be a coup d'etats all over the world for this system. So he says to that one, no, I'll pass on that one again. So at the third one is the devil takes him up to the highest point of the temple in Jerusalem. Another temptation is, jump down. Because it says in Psalm 91 that God has given his angels charge over you, and they're going to bear you up lest you dash your foot against the stone. But what an impression you're going to make on the crowd below if you do that. So the deeper temptation is found a new religion and do it in a blaze of glory. Spend millions of dollars on this campaign. Shout down and say, guys, hey, I'm up here. And everybody looks up and they see this dude, way above on the top of the parapet. And he says, I'm coming to start a new religion. I'm going to call it Roman Catholicism. And it's a great system. I figured it all out. There's going to be a pope who's infallible. And you have to go to Mass on Sunday. And no meat on Fridays. And to show you that I am the Son of God, I'm going to jump. Just watch me. And he jumps off, without bungee jumping, without the bungee, and floats down and goes, oh my God, it's the Son of God. And he starts a new world religion. So that's the temptation. Do something really, really dramatic, get people's attention, and then start a new world religion. Christ did not come to start a world religion. It happened, but that was not his purpose. His purpose was to try to change the theological thinking and the dogma of the time and the feeling that holiness came through legalism, through law and through asceticism, and show that holiness comes through love and compassion and forgiveness. That was his purpose. But the devil is inviting him to start a brand new religion and do it in a very, very dramatic fashion. And he eschews this as well. We see what happens when world religions get started. It goes through the same trajectory again and again and again. You get some kind of an extraordinary charismatic prophet, a Buddha figure, a Jesus figure, a Muhammad figure, and they're really charismatic, dynamic individuals, and people flock around them. They're fascinated by this character, but they don't fully understand the message. They get it a little bit, they get a literal interpretation of it, but they don't fully get it. And then at some stage, the founder dies or is killed or whatever. And then there's a second generation or a third generation leadership that takes over. And now what happens is the huge big super tanker of love that the Christ figure was steering through the waters of the wilderness, you get two tugboats now turning it around. You get the tugboat of theology and the tugboat of dogma, and they turn the entire thing around, and before you know it, it's pointing in the opposite direction. And a character who would say, those who take the sword will perish by the sword. You've heard that it was said to the men of old, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I say to you, love your enemies. That's where the boat was headed. It was compassion, it was love, and it was forgiveness until the two tugboats got at it, and it's turned around, and it's going 180 degrees in the opposite direction within 2 or 3 generations of leadership. They've taken over the little community. They've created an oligarchy. They've substituted dogma and theology for compassion and love, and before you know it, you're going in exactly the opposite direction. So again, Jesus says, you know what? I'll skip on that one as well. And he skipped on all 3. Which brings me to my 4th point. So what then is the purpose of temptation? Temptation gets a really bad rap. We think temptation is a very, very bad thing. In fact, it is vitally important to the process of enlightenment. You can't get enlightened unless you're tempted on a regular basis. So how can you discover whether or not you have free will unless you're dealing with some kinds of temptations? If there are no choices among which to make, to choose, how can you discover whether you're free or not free? Last year, up where I live, I set a garden last year, and I put a fence around the garden, and you can believe me or not believe me, I actually sowed vegetables in it. This lovely vegetable garden. Yeah, I did. I didn't eat them, but I sowed them. And there's a lot of wild pigs in the area. And I go down there one evening, last July, and there are 15 pigs have broken in through the fence. They're inside in the garden and just rooting left, right, and centre. So my brother Seán came out to visit, and we put an electric fence around the whole thing. Now, how do you know whether an electric fence works or not? It was a little solar thing. So there's the fence, 5 strands of the fence, and there's a small little solar panel that's generating electricity, and you turn it on, and I think I hear it clicking, but how do I know it's going to work or not? I'm not going to sit back and wait for the first pig to go, so I have to put the back of my hand and go, and jump. How do you know the electric fence works unless you test it? How do you know that you are free until you're tested? So testing is about temptation. You can't be free until you're tested. So temptation is a hugely important part of the journey, vitally important. So as we engage with life, we're met with a whole bunch of temptations. And temptations are an invitation to discernment. In Ignatian spirituality, they put a lot of emphasis on what they call the discretionis spirituum, the discernment of spirits. Every single one of us is meant to think about the issues at hand and to discern what the proper outcome is. And we feed a whole bunch of data into this. The discerning process, is influenced by the reptilian brain back here, fight or flight. It's influenced by the mammalian brain, which is emotions. It's influenced by the neocortex, which is intellect and logic. It's influenced by intuition. It's influenced by the culture. It's influenced by the mass media. It's influenced by the churches. So in this huge big pot of discernment, it's roiling around looking for some kind of an outcome. And there will be one of 3 outcomes. The first outcome is free will. And free will is the ability to do as I choose. But I can't get to that place unless I've gone from life to temptation to discernment. The second outcome is addiction or slavery. And so I'm totally, in the discernment process, I'm totally giving in to ego gratification, and I wind up actually being a slave to my addiction. Or the third one is freedom. And there's a huge difference between free will and freedom. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. And so the only truly free person is the person who's constantly choosing to do the loving thing. Only to the extent that I'm fully aligned with love and compassion am I free. I'm not free if I'm exercising merely free will, the ability to do as I please, because I'm being governed by some kind of an addiction or some kind of ego journey. So you have to dip into the unconscious and bring it to full consciousness. So there are 4 poles that exercise influences in this process. The first pole is people who are unconsciously doing good. And it's just a random process. They're not doing it because they want to do good. They just happen to make decisions that have good outcomes. But they're not thinking about it at all. It's totally unconscious, it's random, and it's pure luck if it works out well. The second one is unconscious evil. People who are totally unconscious, fast asleep, and they're making decisions or saying things or doing things that have chaotic results. But they're not bad people. They're just asleep. But they're making decisions that lead to some kind of chaos. The third one is conscious evil. And these are people who are very consciously making decisions that have extraordinary repercussions for others. These people have serious pathologies. These are the kind of the Hitlers of our world, who are consciously and deliberately creating systems that have these extraordinary evil outcomes. And then the fourth group is people who are consciously choosing good. So there's 4 poles out of which we're operating. And the whole object of the exercise of temptation is to go from unconscious good and unconscious evil through conscious evil into conscious good. You can't get there without some kind of temptation in the process. So temptation actually is the mechanism by which we're invited into the fullest alignment with love and the fullest alignment with our own divinity. And so even God needs to get tempted. There's a great story. I'm going to finish with this today. A great story in the Midrashim. Midrash is the collection of Jewish stories that are commentaries upon the Bible. And there's this great story that after they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve still are thinking about, God, that fruit really, really tasted good. I wonder, is there any way we could sneak back in there? And so one night they decide to give it a shot. And they climb back in over the wall, and they're up in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they're munching away furiously. And all of a sudden, they hear the foliage moving. And they say, oh, shh, shh. Who's that? And there's somebody else at the other side of the tree moving through the tree. And they wonder who God's name is. They move over, and they open up the branches, and there's God munching on another apple. Even God needs to be tempted. For God to become enlightened, God too needs to grow. Okay.
It was said that the devil offered the world. What makes the devil think the world belongs to him?
Okay, good. What is a great question, Evelyn. The devil said the world belongs to me. Yeah, who would the devil think that the world belonged to him? Yeah, I said there's two answers to that, Evelyn. The first thing is that the devil in every one of us always believes the world belongs to us. You know, when we're operating out of selfishness, we're acting as if the world, in fact, does belong to us. So that's the first kind of facetious answer. And the second answer is, the truth is that in human evolution, it is the oligarchs, the people who grab power through violence, that have been in charge of all of the institutions. Whether it's the political institutions, the economic institutions, religious institutions, military institutions, it is always the power-hungry who grab control of these. And if you can imagine somebody who is an emperor, not just of a region of the world, but who managed to get power over the entire globe, then you're talking about somebody who has the right to dispense. Now, in my cosmology, I totally believe that there are billions and billions and billions of universes out there. According to quantum mechanical theory, there are 10 to the power of 27 brand new universes created every single second for every cubic centimeter of 11-dimensional mathematical space. There's, trillions and trillions and trillions of universes out there. In this universe of ours, there's about 150 billion galaxies. Each galaxy consists of about 200 billion solar systems. So imagine the number of planets out there. So there's life all over this particular cosmos. And there are life forms who are much, much, much more advanced than us. There are life forms out there for whom planet Earth is a little seed in a little garden, the garden being the galaxy itself. There was a great Russian scientist a few years ago that talked about the levels of civilization just in this universe of ours. They said there are 3 types of civilizations. Type 1 is a civilization that has learned how to control all of the resources of its entire planet, but they're doing it in a sustainable fashion. They're learning to control the wind and the waves and the sun, everything that meets their planet, they've learned how to control that. That's a type 1 civilization. He said a type 2 civilization is a civilization that has learned how to harvest the energy, all of the energies of its entire solar system. Its star and the other planets in attendance on that star. But they do it again in a very sustainable fashion. But it's a much superior civilization that control and harness all of the resources of an entire solar system. And a type 3 civilization, he said, is a civilization that has learned how to harvest the energies of an entire galaxy and to do that sustainably. Now, he was asked, what about human beings? Where are they? He said, we're a type 0. We haven't gone yet, but he said the transition from type 0 to type 1 is very dangerous because it involves technology which could allow us to totally destroy our planet. But in that cosmology, there are energies, entities, beings, whether you call them angelic forms or demonic forces, whatever you want to call them, that are far, far, far superior to this little planet of ours. And this little planet is a plaything, that they can move any way they want. And so when the devil says, it's all mine to give to whoever I want, he's not making an idle claim. There are entities who have that kind of power. And the only way they can be contended with and overcome is by aligning with the light, the Jesus figures and the Buddha figures who are even more powerful than those. But we've all seen systems, entire countries, individuals, dictators who've sold their soul to the devil, and the payoff has been they become very, very powerful people, and they create empires. Some of them, the empires last only just 7 years, like the Third Reich. Others last 1,000 years, like the Roman Emperor. Some of them last 3,000 years, like the Egyptian Empire. And so if you're prepared to sell your soul to the devil, depending on how important the character you are, there's a huge payback. So it's not just a symbol, it's also a reality. Mark.
Based on this story, it sounds like Satan is a real guy, just like Jesus is that we can talk to, that could approach us. In your view, is Satan a real guy? And if so, why would God have given Satan all the power that he spoke of in this story?
Okay, brilliant. So is Satan a real guy? I think there are different ways that kind of energy constellates. So in interpersonal dynamics, to the extent that I'm unaware of my shadow material, I'm going to have to project it onto you, Mark, and blame you for the stuff that's actually inside my own heart. So the first kind of shadow is where individual psyche, projects its own unfinished business onto another individual in a relationship. We do then that as communities. An entire community can project its shadow material onto another community. I saw a photograph a few days ago. Somebody sent me an email taken in the 1950s. And it's a diner someplace in Alabama. And there's a white couple sitting down with a black friend. They're sitting at the diner. It's a man and a woman, in their 20s. And there's African-American girl sitting with them. And the entire crowd has gathered behind them. And they're pouring ketchup and salt and all kinds of stuff on the heads of the three people. Now, that's what happens when an entire culture, when its shadow, gets projected. That kind of evil constellates as racism. When you get an entire species, like the human species, refusing to deal with its own darkness, that energy gets projected outwards, and then it symbolically, constellates as an energy form, and you can call it Satan if you want. So in that sense, yes, Satan has that level of power. Now, why did God concede that to him? Now, it's very interesting that in the Hebrew scriptures, the word Satan actually means adversary. And we talked about the book of Job this morning. In the book of Job, it starts off as an encounter where God is talking to the sons of God, whoever they might be. They're having a dialogue. And God says, he's boasting about Job, and he points down to planet Earth and he says, have you seen how good my son Job is? And Satan comes along. Satan is one of the angels in this story. He's the adversary. He's like the prosecuting attorney. He's there to represent another side of the case. And he says, why wouldn't he be good? You've blessed him with children and camels and goats and everything else. Take these things away from him and then see what happens. So in the earlier stories, Satan is merely the prosecutor, who's trying to figure out what the truth of the situation is. And without that presence, Job can't be tempted, and therefore Job can't evolve. So there's 42 chapters in the book of Job, and it shows the progress of Job trying to wrestle with his misfortune until he comes to an outcome, a realization of what's this about. And so in some senses, Satan is as important to salvation history, as Jesus is, in the sense that it is only by looking at the shadow and the light that we can make choices and become fully free people. Otherwise, we're merely automatons. We may as well be robots who've been pre-programmed to do the good thing. If we're not going to be pre-programmed that we have some measure of free will, there have to be choices. And then there have to be archetypes that represent the consequences of particular choices. And in that sense, Satan is the archetype that represents constant choices for greed, aggression, and personal self-interest. So in that sense, it's a very real kind of an energy. Carmen Seta.
Jesus was 40 days without food.
Yeah.
How about water?
Okay. Did you want to add something to that? Okay.
I can't believe a person
Okay.
can live without water for that long.
They can't.
Yeah.
They can't. And so, fasting, there are many different kind of understandings of what the actual fast looked like. So there was a really that Jesus went without any food or any water for 40 days. You can't go more than 4 or 5 days without water and and crash completely. You can go for about. There were 2 Irish brothers in the 1920s when we were trying to force the British out of Ireland who went on hunger strike from my city. They were called the O'Shea brothers, and one of them lasted 105 days, and the other guy lasted 110 days. So you can go for a long period without food, but less than a week without water, and only minutes without air, obviously. So one of the understandings is that Jesus lived in the desert for 40 days, and he just made do with whatever food he can kind of find in the desert, whatever that was. So it wasn't that he was just strictly without any food or any water, but that he was living a life just dependent upon the very meager resources available to him right then. And so the object of fasting is not so much to punish the body as it is to create an altered state of consciousness. And fasting is a well-known method of altering your states of consciousness, however severe the fast is. Whether it's, I have a Hindu friend who did a 70-day fast, on just fruit juices of various kinds, extracts of various kinds, but no solid food for 70 days. So it's a question of, what can you do without, punishing your body to the level that it can't recover, and at the same time induce an altered state of consciousness that allows you access to these other kinds of dimensions. And part of the reason why he could have an encounter with Satan is that Satan is an interdimensional being. He may or may not have taken on physical articulation, but as Jesus is, moving through these other dimensions, he's encountering energies and entities in these dimensions. So it becomes much easier to have an encounter with that kind of force. But I agree with you. He couldn't have lasted 40 days without water. It's impossible. Yeah. Rita, and then Marilyn. Rita, and then Marilyn.
I'm probably going to get myself in trouble here because I don't remember exactly. But in one of my studies, between you, Robert Powell, and Rudolf Steiner, I don't get into Eckhart, Meister Eckhart. But anyway, it runs in my mind that, and it's early in the morning now, that God gave all of his power, but only half of his love.
To whom?
To Lucifer.
I would disagree totally with that. I don't think for God to be is to love. God cannot parcel out, portions of his love to one and to another. God loves unconditionally. Because I remember shocking my grandmother when a small child. I lived with my grandparents for the first 6 years of my life, and my great-grandmother lived with us as well. And every night we'd kneel down and say the rosary. And my great-grandmother would sit at the fire. She was the only one that was allowed to sit, and we would kneel around in a circle. And at the end of the rosary, there was what were called the trimmings. So the rosary was just the 5 decades, and that took typically about 15 minutes. But the trimmings took about another 20 minutes, where you'd pray for everybody. Michael Murphy just went to England. Keep him safe. Don't let him become a Protestant. Somebody else is doing an exam this week. Make sure they pass their exam. Yeah. Somebody else's cow is sick. Make the cow better. So we'd all be adding our little 2 cents to it. And at one stage, I don't know where it came out of, I said, in the middle of this, I said, God, please forgive the devil and bring him back into heaven. And there's this shock silence. And my grandma says, what are you saying, child? And my great-grandmother turned to her. She was her daughter, Frances. She said, Frances, leave him alone. God knows exactly what he means. And so even as a child, it felt to me, Satan is not irredeemably lost. Satan was a necessary part of salvation history, and that was his function in a sense. So I don't believe that God gives half his love to one and 3/4 to another. For God to be is to love, and Satan is his beloved of God. And this is going to really shock you, reader. Satan is as beloved of God as Jesus is. He's a part of salvation history, without which we would not be able to develop free will, freedom, compassion, and forgiveness.
The only reason why I can think of that God might have done that was to show eventually civilizations which thing is more powerful, which thing is the greatest gift to have, power or love.
Yeah, that's our job on planet Earth, is to come to that conclusion ourselves and to model it in our personal lives and in our structures, whether the economic models, political systems, religious. We're here to model that love, that unconditional love of God, and to show that love is much more powerful than merely control of resources. Marilyn was next, I think, Michael.
In the prayer, Our Father, we say, Lord, lead us not into temptation. Right. But according to what you were, if I was hearing correctly this morning, you were saying that temptation is a necessary part on the road to enlightenment. Okay. So why are we praying?
Okay. Good. It's a great question. So why are we praying, lead us not into temptation? The prayer that Jesus taught us, if temptation is a part of the journey. So the problem was, Jesus was asked to teach his disciples how to pray in a brief statement. If they'd asked him to unpack that, depending on his audience, he would have unpacked it to the level that the audience could comprehend. And so as a little quickie, that's true. In the same way that when Christ says, if your right eye scandalize you, pluck it out and throw it away. Better to enter heaven with one eye than to be in hell with 2 eyes. If your right leg scandalize you, cut it off. Better to enter heaven with 1 leg than to be in hell with 2 legs. If we took that literally, heaven would be peopled with blind amputees. That's all we're getting there. Really. So obviously that's not an injunction to kind of plucking out eyes and cutting off limbs. It's Christ is the ultimate shock jock. And so he's going to put stuff in really graphic terms very quickly. So he's going to teach them the Our Father, and there's only 7 lines in the Our Father. So in just 7 quick hits, he's going to encapsulate a whole bunch of truths. But if you were to tease him on it and kind of ask him to tease that asunder and pull it out, he would show to you that the temptation was a very important part of his own ministry. That's how he reached the fullness of his own enlightenment, was to dealing with these temptations up front. So lead us not into temptation is about don't let us bite off more than we can chew. So I think that before each soul comes into a specific incarnation, we plan the circumstances of our incarnation. We plan the body we're going to come into, the family we're going to be a part of, the religion, we're going to be raised in, the socioeconomic status we belong to, the IQ level we're going to have, the ethnicity to which we belong. And we get total carte blanche to plan it any way we want, except we have some kind of a divine mentor helping us saying, do you really think you can manage all of that? Do you really think that if you're born into a crippled body in a dysfunctional family, that you'd really be up to that? Are you kind of biting off more than you can chew? So in some senses, it's not to let hubris tell us that we're more advanced than we are, or more enlightened than we are, but to pace ourselves. We need to stretch ourselves each incarnation, but not to aim so far ahead that we're going to just wind up, despairing and then committing suicide or something. So for me, lead us not into temptation is about, with the guidance of a mentor, choosing an incarnation that stretches me, but doesn't make it impossible for me to reach my targets, and that therefore I give up in despair and maybe suicide. Yeah. Susie, and then Karen.
I've been thinking about that, and I think maybe you sort of addressed it. It's like the 3 different freedom, free
Slavery
will, and slavery. Like in our lives, isn't it kind of a mixture of all
Absolutely.
3?
Absolutely.
In order, you always have to practice freedom
Yes.
to become enlightened.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. We're constantly moving in and out of these pieces. So, the good-bad split is not between good people and bad people, or between good communities and bad communities. It runs down through each one of us. There's darkness, there's shadow, material, and light in every single one of us. And so the journey of incarnation is the wilderness in which, we're constantly having to make choices. And to the extent that we make conscious choices, we're more likely to make free choices. To the extent that we make unconscious choices just by letting circumstances lead us, we're inevitably going to get into a whole bunch of trouble. But only the really pathological are going to make conscious choices to do evil things. Some do. But most of us are making, choices to do bad things because we're unconscious. We're not fully conscious. So bringing to awareness is the key. And that's why the Buddha would claim that the primary virtue of all, more important even than love, is being awake. So the image I use sometimes is like, if you imagine a treasure chest which is locked, and you want to get access to the treasure, but it's locked, you have to have a key. Awareness is the key that opens the treasure chest. And what's inside in it is love. But to get access to love, you need the key of becoming awake. So in that sense, awakeness, being Buddha, is the primary virtue that gives you access to the gold. Now the thing is, what are you going to do with the gold? Are you going to pay your school fees? Are you going to buy food for the kids? Are you going to pay your mortgage? Are you going to go out and buy an Uzi, and raid the liquor store? So once you get access to the gold, you can turn it any way you want. So Satan represents what happens when you turn gold into vice, and Christ represents what happens when you turn gold into virtue. So every single virtue is simply a different articulation of love in a different circumstance. So in one circumstance, love looks like patience. In another circumstance, love looks like resilience. In another circumstance, love looks like forgiveness. In another circumstance, love looks like a sense of humor. And so basically every single virtue is just love in a different environment. And each vice, is the same, love principle being directed for self-aggrandishment or aggressive ways. Yeah, so we're constantly moving through these pieces. So Karen and then Ria.
So I find this notion of God continuing to evolve very mysterious. If there's a transcendence of God, which is complete in every sense, and there's the manifestation which is incomplete. And so this idea of having them, so we're the manifestation in everything we do, and as bite-sized pieces of God, we are that unfinished portion of, it makes sense to me that and then the notion of the devil as as an important, a vital piece of salvation history, all of that makes sense, and the idea that it's all working under the same kind of law. All of that makes sense. I just, it's that connection between the immanence and the transcendence that is still not forming. So
Okay.
maybe you could talk a little more about that.
It's a very difficult thing to kind of wrap our heads around. The fact that there's an aspect of God which is totally other, utterly transcendent, and radically ineffable, which means it cannot be articulated. We cannot say anything about it. It's totally, the mystery is totally beyond us. The funny thing is we can experience it, and we all do, but we can't articulate it. As soon as we do, it leaks out. But there's the God who then expresses herself through her creation. And that creation is evolving. And that's what the Jewish story of God on the other side of the tree eating the apple himself, that's God incarnate, in manifestation, also attempting to develop, and meeting temptations in that process. It's not the kind of the transcendence of God needing to kind of grow or evolve, but it's God as he's represented in all of our creation. So it's this dance between immanence and transcendence. That's the dance of incarnation. And it's a dance that every single one of us does. Because basically, every single one of us is a bite-sized piece of God that we call a soul that volunteered for a human incarnation. So there's a transcendent aspect to us, and there's an immanent aspect to us. The immanent one is the one we tend to identify with. We think we are our bodies, or we think we are our emotions, or we think we are our thoughts, and we're not. They're resources, that the soul needs in order to experience an incarnational experience. And we test ourselves in order to find out, no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, could you learn to love anyway? If you were a slave girl in North Africa in the 1300s, could you learn how to love? If you were a CEO in Silicon Valley in 2016, could you learn how to love? So no matter what configuration of circumstances you find yourself in, have you got the ability to remember who you are and recognize who everybody else really is, and then say, Namaste, the divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. So that is the great dance of incarnation. And that's what's meant by, in some senses, the beginning of the temptation story of Jesus. There are two other pieces that weren't mentioned in Luke's account. One is that he goes into the desert and he's surrounded by beasts, wild beasts. And the other one is at the end of the temptation, he is ministered to by the angels. Luke does not have that account. Matthew has that account. And so, in some senses, the wilderness is the incarnational experience. Every single one of us is in the desert, fasting and being tempted. Life is the desert, wilderness, where we're, in some senses, cut off from the resources of knowing that we are God. And we're surrounded by the beasts. What the beasts are, the denizens of the unconscious, the parts of ourselves that are driving our behavior, even when we're totally unaware of them. And the angels that minister at the end are the higher part of ourselves, the part of us that remembers that we are indeed children of God. And so we're dancing between these two poles, the beasts of the unaware, unconscious part of their physical extension, and the angels of our higher level of the soul. That's the dance of incarnation that we all volunteered for. I think Ria was next. But that's a great Ria. Okay, Olivia. Deb.
So I'm working with the image of the treasure chest. And the practice of love, which we get to experience, it seems like we have many, many opportunities to discover as well as refine our experience and our practice of love. So that when we come to that moment of putting the key in the treasure chest and lifting the lid, and we discover the deepest, most divine meaning of love, then that changes everything
Really.
from the time of first separation until that moment.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And the problem for a lot of us is that once we discover the treasure chest and we find the key and we open it and we see what's inside, we kind of close it back down, look around to see if anybody else saw it, and then grab it and go hide it someplace, and then go back and access it as we want, instead of realizing that there's enough for everybody and more besides. And that's what, the Buddha said, if I were to turn all the mountains of all the worlds into gold, there wouldn't be enough for one person's greed. If greed is operative, I'm going to lock the box right down, go hide it, and just go whistle pretend, I'm a pauper, and then go back regularly and access it as I need it. But the person who really understands it throws it open and calls everybody to the feast, because there's enough for everybody there. Yeah. Margaret. Okay. Do you want to make a comment? Go ahead,
How could, if you open the box, which is total love,
yeah.
how could you close it?
Yeah.
And I mean, keep it for yourself, because then you don't have love in the box.
Yeah. The love is always there. The question is,
You don't see it then.
who's opening the box? Is it the ego or the soul? If the ego opens the box, it sees the love and it wants to hold it, because love is seen as a resource, a way of controlling and getting access to other kind of needs. Whereas, so when the soul opens the box and sees it, it recognizes that this is God's stuff that belongs to everybody, and there's enough for everybody. So the question is, who's opening the box?
I guess maybe that comes from, I had a dream in the last couple of years where I experienced compassion, perfect compassion. And so that's what I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
If you, and it comes and goes. You never have that same intense feeling, and it's just sort of a dream. But I was thinking when you said that if you really experienced that, you wouldn't be able to hide it.
Let me use another metaphor, another great story from Greek mythology that addresses that story, Margaret. There's a great story in Greek mythology about a beggar sitting at the side of the road, and there's another beggar a few 100 yards away from it, and they're begging for stuff. And the king comes along in his big coach. And he looks out the window, and all of a sudden he says, "Oh my God, I recognize that guy." He gets out, stops the horses, comes out, has a dialogue with this beggar, and it transpires that this beggar was his brother that was kidnapped as a 6-month-old baby and taken away, and never knew who his parents were. And the king is overjoyed that he's met his younger brother. He says, "I'll just stay right here. I'm going to go back to the palace. I'm going to get all kinds of fine robes for you. I'm going to come back and dress you. In the meantime, here are 3 bags of gold. Hold on to them." Gets back into his carriage and he drives away. The other beggar comes over and says, "What did he give you?" And he says, "I just realized I'm royalty. I'm the king's brother. And he gave me these 3 bags of gold." And the guy says, "I don't believe it." He said, "Spill them out on the ground. Let's have a look." And they open the first bag and spill it out, and there's 100 gold coins. And they open the second bag and they spill them out, and there's 100 gold coins. And he opens the third bag and he spills them out, and there's 99 gold coins and 1 copper coin. And the other guy says to him, "See, I told you it was funny." Yeah? He's gone back home and he's having a great laugh at you. He's saying, "You can't believe it. I met this dude at the side of the road and I persuaded him he was my brother, and I gave him a few bags of gold, and he thinks I'm going to come back with clothes." And so the beggar is really distraught. He just throws the money there and gets up and walks away. And about 2 hours later, the king comes back, says, "Where's my brother?" And the other guy says, "I don't know." Meantime, this other guy has buried the gold, and he goes off with the gold. And so, you can have 299 gold coins and 1 copper coin and focus on the copper coin and think that you were kind of defrauded. And that's what so many of us do. We're surrounded by blessings non-stop. Every breath I take is a blessing. But I can talk about my aches and pains and who hurt me when I was 3, if I choose. Somebody else, Chris.
Yeah, I wonder if you could. I'm become real cynical about free will.
We've had this discussion before, Chris.
I know, but it helps to rehash things a little, maybe. Yeah, a couple examples. One is my own life. I just feel like I'm a total robot because there are things that I consciously want to do, and I'm psychologically blocked. And I'm talking a lot of things are just simple things. And I see myself as a conditioned being and being run by deep core beliefs that I cannot access. So that's one example. The other is you take monsters like Hitler and Stalin, and you look at how they were raised, and they were so really brutalized, and then you wonder, well, how could they have turned out any differently, you know? So I've just spent a lot of time feeling powerless, so I don't know if you want to comment on that.
So I'll start by making the same response I made last year when you asked this question, and then I'll go on a little bit. So the first thing is, I said to you last year, I remember, is that the first stage of waking up is realizing I'm asleep. So the first stage of becoming free is realizing I'm enslaved. And you're well beyond that place, Chris, because you have learned how to identify what the oppressive forces in the psyche are and what the oppressive forces sociologically are. A lot of people have not reached that place. So a lot of people who are still being driven by unconscious forces and who actually believe that the world is as the world presents itself. So you're very far along in your wakefulness process. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that when I talked about the journey from life to temptation to discernment, and I said in that bucket of discernment, the hindbrain is at work there, the mammalian brain is at work there, the neocortex is at work there, intellect is at work there, logic is at work there, intuition is at work there, the media are at work there, the churches are at work there. So it's all these influences trying to influence, the discernment process. And depending on the outcome of that, I'm going to go then in one of three directions: free will, freedom, or slavery. Now, complicating the picture is that I think that personality, and therefore free will as well, is a composite of three factors. It is genetics, environment, and the soul's previous history. So we're not just a kind of a mishmash between nature and nurture. They're important, but they're nowhere near as important as the trajectory of an old soul coming in. So you could take an old soul that's traversed this planet many, many, many times and put it into a crippled body in a dysfunctional family, and it'll shine anyway. You could take a young soul, put it into an athletic body, into a loving family, and it'll screw up anyway. So there's these three other factors, at work in this. But the whole thing is about trying to bring to awareness that those forces that keep us controlled. And the interesting thing is, there are people imprisoned who are far more free than you or I. People in the archipelago who've come to a place of inner freedom, and the fact that they're wearing manacles, and won't see fresh air for the rest of their lives, they're free inside in a way that you and I are not. Because they've realized the inner freedom, which is total freedom then, not just free will, but freedom. All of us are on a spectrum somewhere along that, and you're nowhere near the end of the spectrum that you claim you're on, Chris. I know you well enough to know how far along that spectrum you are. Give us a smile. Good. Okay. Jay.
Yeah, Father, you mentioned earlier in your sermon that it's up to us to love and do as God wills. And then you mentioned a moment ago about the transcendent. It seems to me if we identified with that, then we'd automatically be doing what God wills. Yes. Well, I know I'm not quite there yet.
Welcome to the human family.
I'm sorry?
Welcome to the human family.
Yeah.
Show me somebody who is.
And but I'm wondering what can help me be a little more selfless and a little less selfish. In other words, to be more loving and to, are there practical ways to enhance that other than become enlightened, which, like I said, that's a ways off.
There's lots and lots of different practices. Spirituality basically is a compendium of practices that allow us to make it more likely for us to become enlightened at some stage. So, for instance, in Buddhism, they say meditation, enlightenment is an accident, but if you meditate regularly, you become accident prone. So there are things you can do that make it more likely that you will align yourself more quickly. Different kinds of practices. But just off the top of my head, in response to this question, I think listening to feedback from the people in my life, both the people who love me and the people who regard me as their enemy, By listening to feedback, I got an immediate ability to kind of readjust my performance. So that's a very, very simple way of dealing with my own blind spots, because every one of us has blind spots. You know, in Latin they say, nemo judex in causa sua. Nobody can be a judge in their own case. It's very hard for us to see our own stuff. But if any kind of relationship you're in, you're going to be getting feedback. Now, sometimes this feedback will be widely exaggerated and done from the wrong. Tom, are you giving your feedback right now? I saw that look. We're all getting feedback constantly. But most of us, we eschew the feedback. You know, that's your problem. Don't talk to me about it. And so even if feedback is coming from an enemy, and I'm getting it from several different enemy figures, there must be some kind of kernel of truth in it. And I said to you one time that in my time in Kenya, part of what I had to do, because I worked with a nomadic population that was just learning agriculture, was being an agricultural instructor. And realizing very, very quickly that as we grew maize, if we had to choose between putting fertilizer on the seeds or weeding it subsequently, and we had to choose between them for some reason, it was far more important to weed than it was to fertilize. Fertilizer is blind. You put fertilizer down on the equator, 122 degrees temperature, torrential rains, and you're going to get just a wilderness there within a few weeks. So weeding is much more important. So God makes sure that there are two kinds of people in our lives: the fertilizers, who love us unconditionally, and without whom we wouldn't have a good self-image or any kind of self-confidence. They're vital to us. But also we need weeders. If there were no weeders in our life, we'd all become total narcissists. And so one powerful way of constantly adjusting my performance and identifying what my blind spots are is either to work with the feedback I get unsolicitedly, or occasionally ask for feedback from people whom I trust and think who are going to tell me the truth lovingly, and compassionately. So that's one very simple little exercise. How are we doing for time, Michael?
3 minutes till.
Okay, so Margaret will give you the last question. Well, can you wait until we get the microphone?
I just have a story to tell.
Oh, great.
A couple of years ago at Christmas time, my family is gathered and we're all opening presents, and there's chaos and noise and all this stuff. And I'm opening a box, and it's a box within a box within a box. And when I got to it, there was nothing in the box. My son came up to me and he whispered in my ear. I mean, this boy was very poor at this point. He didn't have anything.
Okay.
He said, "Mom, it's a box full of love."
Wow, that is beautiful, Margaret.
So I have gotten that box.
That is brilliant, Lovey. That is awesome. That's a great place to stop, guys. Thank you so much.
That little box is on top of my computer,
Are you
and
serious?
I see it every day.
That's brilliant, Lovey. That's brilliant. Brilliant. Namaste, guys. So before we continue with our Eucharist, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.